We are all looking forward to this, and I won't take up much time. Obviously, Sean, we doesn't need an introduction, but I'll just read out the bio he had sent us. Uh, Sean is fascinated by how people consciously and unconsciously narrate their stories to others. His academic career has involved practice and teaching of oral history methodology, and his PhD from Essex was on Windermere Kensington community and the apartheid forced displacement, and was completed in 96. He began working in the department in 97 as a coordinator of the Western Cape Oral History Project, and also served as the director of the Center for Popular Memory from 2001 to 2012. And Sean's current research involves post-colonial oral histories of violence and debates about trauma theory, memory, and psychoanalysis. Thank you, Sean, for agreeing to share your work with us. And I mean, just basic housekeeping, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion for the rest of the time. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll just close my video just to facilitate if there is any network problem. Looking forward. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks very much, Anandrup, and thanks for people for coming. This is a somewhat maybe overly theoretical paper, but as a backdrop, I had sabbatical of this strange 18 months that we've all had during the pandemic and its restrictions. I've had 9 months on sabbatical, 9 months on teaching. But even my 9 months on sabbatical was strange in the sense that I couldn't do any oral history fieldwork that I was planning to do. And I certainly did not want to do oral histories on Zoom. But just before the pandemic hit home, if some of you might remember, I gave I presented a draft book proposal in March of last year, or just before the pandemic, which is about a very ambitious 10-chapter book. But during the sabbatical under pandemic circumstances, I've slashed that down radically. And I decided, largely because I couldn't do oral history, I mean, to grapple with a lot of the theoretical questions that I've been, partly grappling with in different articles, and certainly often discussing more in my oral history and trauma classes. And I think, as things stand at the moment, to tell you, this book that I'm working on is really going to be more of an intervention into theory, methods, and debates about oral history and the post-colonial. And other kind of intertwining issue is obviously the question that I raised and discussed in the last presentation 18, 19 months ago about anti-referential trauma. Okay, let me just read. I prepared it, would you believe or not? I'm not accustomed to writing papers anymore, but I have written a lecture script, which is possibly too long. Okay. It's entitled Illuminating Intersubjectivity, which will become hopefully a bit clearer what I mean by that at the end of the presentation. Let me start off with what is psychic trauma? How does it operate, and with what effects through oral history dialogues? I'm striving to, and have through my teaching and recent writing, to develop, conceptualize an anti-referential logic of psychic trauma that is constituted outside of language, but which impresses upon intersubjective social relationality between subjects, spaces, and objects. It's crucial to acknowledge trauma as a relational construct that connects the inside and the outside of the subject. And this requires historical attention to both the referentiality of language, in its everyday sense, and the anti-referential dimensions of subject formation. Anti-referential scholars have argued that psychic trauma cannot be reduced to any language, nor any other textual form of representation. An anti-referential analytic means that it's not possible to isolate trauma amongst the spoken words, sentences, and stories that oral storytellers have crafted to frame their memories. Moreover, the conflation of painful feelings and other difficult emotions with trauma is become a very popular referential tendency that has gained conceptual currency across several academic disciplines. And yes, of course, when survivors of violence go through various forms of violence, particularly mass violence, there is an intrusion, there is a rupturing of their defenses, an overwhelming dimension of experiencing mass violence or more intimate one-on-one violence. And these rupturing historical experiences of violence are extremely disturbing, obviously, for human subjects. But that in itself cannot be deployed as defining features of trauma, nor conflated into the category of trauma. I think trauma is a far more elusive concept than what it's made out to be by various referential scholars. How does the anti-referential logic of psychic trauma configure or impress on the memories and narratives of violence and effects which we hear in and outside oral history dialogues? If you want an example, with all due respect to scholars that use this terminology, example of what is referential trauma discourses, then I would say PTSD is the most classic, most prevalent example. And a key part of the referential conceptions of trauma by PTSD is the negligible or no analytic emphasis on the prior histories of the family, of culture, and other structures. In particular, the ahistorical denial of childhood stages of self-constitution erases psychological means to understand psychic trauma. And this is really, really common amongst PTSD conceptions. In fact, someone like Roger Lacoste has argued that it's the snapping of that psychoanalytic connection that has led to PTSD becoming so popular as various other scholars. In my view, as an oral historian, therefore, I'm pulled back into kind of, and I always have had a love for all life history interviews. But there's a priority now to doing life history of a particular kind with the survivors of violence. Oral historians must listen in literal and non-literal ways to the speaking subject who they converse with in the here and now to elicit memories about the then and there of past violence. Interviewing survivors of violence also leads to the narrative versions of what I would call life, not just life stories, but life and death stories, and which opens up questions which many interviewees who experience violence grapple with. They grapple with their various forms of vulnerability, and they grapple with their mortality. Oral historians must give more attention to both the living and the deceased in terms of how people think about it, but also around people, the various family members and loved ones that survivors of violence have lost. Forms of loss around them shapes their life stories. It shapes how they think and their beliefs and actions. And of course, the issue of grieving, or trying to understand what is shaping the grieving of survivors is central. If our historians are going to deploy an anti-referential analytic of trauma, then developing a psychoanalytic sensibility is, as far as I'm concerned, crucial, and will help attune how we listen, navigate, and interpret the ebbs and flows of dialogues about memory. This means that oral historians must continue to emphasize open-ended ways to make sense of the storyteller's unconscious, which is involved in one of the kind of many strands of psychoanalytic thinking, which are usually kind of fall within the very broad frame of post-Freudian in a loose sense. But intersubjective framing of dialogues has become popular across several schools of psychoanalytic thinking after the Second World War. Moreover, for questions that oral historians ask might, of course, in the dialogue evoke various visceral emotions and provide clues about the aftermath of violence that the storyteller is working through and attempting to grasp in the form of language. These dialogues might also elicit other traces, such as repetitions, bodily sensations, uncanny associations that are possibly linked, not necessarily, but possibly linked to what some scholars have called the afterwardsness of psychic trauma. I draw on scholars who argue that the traces of afterwardsness are belatedly manifest through what some have called the dialectic or the seesaw relationship between the conscious and the unconscious of the storyteller. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to maybe skip forward a bit. Well, I mean, obviously, historical events of violence remain important, but I want to emphasize that for doing this kind of oral history, a lot more emphasis has to be placed on an exploration of how the narrator craft their periodization of the past, how the narrator signifies what they see as events that are pivotal to shaping their lives. The watersheds must be defined by them, not, the prevailing status quo or wherever. When discussing violent past events, signified as significant by political systems, I think, is not the key issue. It's what the subject is trying to grapple with, which sometimes is just a kind of a following of whatever the ideology is telling them, but it's looking for the ways in which they deviate from what they've been subscribed to or circumscribed to, or whatever the prevailing cultures or ideologies are telling them. So through empathic skills, the oral historian potentially facilitates the contained space for the narrator. But I want to introduce a notion that, that it's not usually used in oral history theory, and some of you might be objective, but I think all life history, expressions of life history narratives are to some extent shaped by narcissism. We narcissistically want to or need to tell our stories to another, a certain kind of empathic, attuned listener. It's obviously our role as oral historians, it's not our role to be critical of this narcissistic expression of life stories. Rather, creating a kind of facilitatory storytelling spaces is central. But if we are to comprehend the logic of anti-referential trauma, we must trace the speaking subject to the relationality of the along and against the grain of the consciously and unconsciously lived archive, with obvious, sort of hinting at Laura and Stoller there. Moreover, has sufficient analytic attention been given to the language and subject constitution of the oral history narrator? Given, quite obviously, I have to tell this audience, given the various imperial histories of language, which has been dominated by forms of political subjugation, English, Dutch, Danish, etc., I think it's crucial for oral historians to pay more attention to the vernacular, the multilingual, and I would argue the translatory dynamics that are involved in telling oral stories. It's absolutely vital if we are going to conceptualize post-colonial oral history approach to psychic trauma and afterwards. In seeking clues about anti-referential trauma, we must also reflect on our own roles as historians through this dialogic of the intersubjective. And the intersubjective on a superficial level is merely about the relationships that people have, how they interact with each other, the spontaneity or the conflict. And that's a very important dimension of the intersubjective. But there are other layers to the intersubjective, which I'll come to soon. What both oral historian and narrator feel during the shifting intersubjective moods of interviews possibly indicates how the unconscious of each participant is informing each other. Intersubjective dimensions of conversational dialogues during fieldwork matters, and it's, to state the obvious, it's not simply during the interview, but before, during, and after recorded interviews are critical. But the rules of academic disciplines that we try to follow, the research protocols, and the rule-bound cultural and linguistic grammars intersect and interweave, structuring how both the researcher and the research engage in oral history dialogues. But bounded rules are not fixed, and their efficacy varies and must be read in conjunction with the intersubjectively shifting emotional atmospheres and spaces through which storytelling unfolds. In summary, the interpretive process involves repeated reading and listening to multiple versions of the oral history transcript, audio and written, to illuminate the traces of afterwardsness that punctuate the oral narration of memories of violence. I probably don't have time, but there's a section in the paper where I then, and we can come back to in this discussion time, where I grapple with, try to summarize the conceptual knots of trying to develop a post-colonial oral history approach to violence. The first knot, very quickly. What?
Sorry, Sean, you have enough time. You have enough time, just to be.
Oh, okay. I'm only on, yeah. The first conception knot, a quick few points, is about history and psychoanalysis. That's been where this whole project in part started. And out of the struggling with the history and psychoanalysis, the key text that shaped and gave me hope, if you like, is the article by Joan Scott entitled The Incommensurable Psychoanalysis and History. My friend, and out of that kind of grappling with Joan Scott's work, I framed this notion of the unhealable, and I got fascinated by this through what I call the unpopular antonyms of the TLC. So instead of looking at healing, looking at the unhealable, instead of looking at reconciliation, looking at the irreconcilable, and so on. So my framing of the unhealable does not deny the importance of the reparative urge that some historians have. But if you're trying to pull towards the psychoanalytic, if I may quote one of my PhD supervisors, what becomes more important is to try and understand the centrality and the importance of disappointment. Disappointment is absolutely central to living subjects. So in this book, I'm hoping to contribute by deconstructing the various fantasies that people have and expectations they have for their lives and for how they deal with various crises or emotional problems. I'm not arguing for psychohistory. I'm not attempting to marry history and psychoanalysis. But I'm persuaded by Joan Scott's argument that we've got to keep the incommensurable relationality between psychoanalysis and history. And that involves grappling with her, and to brief praise, she hones in on two key things that makes history and psychoanalysis incommensurable. That is questions of causality and questions of temporality. I'm particularly interested in the temporality issue. And as Scott argues, and also what's amazing about Scott is how she brings in various arguments about language. Bear in mind that neither the historian nor the psychoanalyst nor the speaking subject himself can fully comprehend the configuration of the unconscious constituted during early childhood. Scott argues that language operates as a structure of subjectification, the inauguration of a subject into the symbolic social order, and as a vocabulary representing a cultural repertoire of psychic states, such as ambivalence, which is, she calls, a double operation that historians should analyze. But let me move on. I don't have the time to take this further, but the second conceptual knot is about oral history and trauma theory. And there, I think teaching the trauma course over 5 years has helped me a lot to develop my critiques of PTSD and to use Joan Scott's arguments and arguments of people like Ruth Lees and Roger Lockhart to critique the referential discourses of PTSD. So that's the second conceptual knot. The one there, I feel maybe I am more equipped. The third conceptual knot is about the relationship, which I wanted to raise with this audience. I'm curious to know you, is about oral history and post-colonial theory. While spatial location is relevant, merely following the generic oral history research steps when working in a prior colony like South Africa or wherever does not make it post-colonial oral history. For example, in post-apartheid South Africa, essentialist or recovery mode oral history approaches still dominate, which is at odds with the structures orientation of what I understand post-colonial historical scholarship. I'll give you a small anecdote, and in some ways, it's also one of the starting points of this project. After 2015 seminar presentation, I walked out of B240, and a colleague, not from UCT, from somewhere else, told me that I needed to choose between remaining an oral historian or becoming a post-colonial scholar. I couldn't be an oral historian and a post-colonial scholar. I was quite dumbstruck by this request. It wasn't a nasty request, she was just making a statement. This is due to many former oral historians in post-colonial Africa breaking from oral history methodology for various theoretical and other reasons. But I differ with the assumption that oral history, for all its problems, which I've discussed and grappled with for many years, I differ with the assumption that oral history and post-colonial scholarship are mutually exclusive. There are differences. Certainly, post-colonial scholarship tend to have some structuralist orientation or post-colonial theory in comparison to the various empiricist or other kind of agentic-driven type models of oral history theory. But I want to get away from that binary construction, and rather through the incommensurable rationality of history and psychoanalysis from Joan Scott, I'm really committed to trying to develop, but I'm hoping conceptually to develop a more rigorous form of post-colonial oral history theory. Call me narcissistic and crazy, but that's where I'm headed. to state the obvious, pioneering post-colonial scholars, not oral historians now, but have grappled with psychoanalytic or the psychological. Famously, Frans Fanon, everyone in South Africa will know, but there are others like Ashish Nandi from the subcontinent who have developed forms of psychoanalysis, challenge colonial racism and post-colonial violence, both of the referential and anti-referential kind. I suppose the more current scholar that I find most useful is Steph Krapps, that's his name, who argues that anti-referential trauma approaches to post-colonial witnessing is the more effective way to analyze the constitution of the post-colonial subject, and they're grappling with through various forms of past violence. Moreover, although he doesn't directly deal with these issues, but I think he's been profoundly influential in my thinking, is Akio Mbembe's work, such as his historical genealogy of racial discourses through imperial networks in his most recent book, The Critique of Black Reason. And he's clearly providing various anti-referential analysis of racism, violence, and trauma. But let me turn back to, in a sense, my mentor when I was, growing up as a student. Turning back to Alessandro Botelli's seminal article, What Makes Oral History Different? He argued that oral history dialogues are necessarily constructed through multiple identity differences between the researcher and the oral storyteller. This has inspired generations of oral historians working on various topics. However, the ways in which the alterity of racial identity construction, consciously and unconsciously, frames oral history dialogues has received insufficient attention by oral historians, in my view. It's something I started to work on with the critical empathy article just about a year or two ago. While Portelli's analysis of identity difference is useful, I'm aiming to move beyond Portelli by exploring the relationality of recognition and misrecognition of participants in oral history dialogue, being constructed to the unequal, widespread power involving what I'm going to call, and this is the other key phrase I'm kind of coined, it's building on Portelli, but I'm trying to grapple with the notion of irreconcilable differences between the researcher and the research, which is shaping what is said, how it is said, and what is not said. And the fourth section, which I really don't have time to go into, is about intergenerational critiques of the sort of intergenerational trauma issue. And I prefer to talk about sort of intergenerational subject formation in different ways. I can come back to that later. But I want to move on beyond the cluster about the intergenerational, which is very interesting, and turn to the issue, the tricky issue of narcissism and precarity. I think I've read a lot of Judith Butler during the sabbatical, and I'm really, I'm quite enamored by the concept of precarity. But so is the notion of narcissism, which is a long history of being engaged with by various scholars. Two quick quotes, firstly by Julie Walsh. Narcissism is never only the story of one. The precarious presence of the narcissist environment of care, the everyday phenomena of parental narcissism, and the sociological characteristics of intimacy testify to the fact that narcissism and sociability are combined. And then, on a slightly different tangent, an article with the briefest title, Possible Echo, by Gayatri Spivak. She says narcissism is the effacement of the trace of the other in the desire of the one. A little bit more about that as I develop. Clarifying connections between the unhealable and the unfulfillable desires must be worked through. While desires, needs, and wants might be partially met during our everyday activities, fantasies of reaching full fulfillment are impossible due to the tragic structure of subject formation, through the subjection force of language, culture, ideology. But when these forms of subjection fail, it reveals clues about the narcissistic needs and dimensions of subjectivity. There are various different psychoanalytic schools that grapple with this notion of, from Freud to Lacan and others. I don't have the time to go into this. But please note this, while in our everyday language, narcissism tends to have a sort of popular culture notion of being always bad. Most of these theorists are not saying that narcissism is inherently bad. In fact, they're saying they are arguing that it's at the center of the constitution of the subject. But the tricky question is, how does everyday narcissism, like the desire to be seen, to be mirrored, to become self-confident, which are positive forms of understandable forms of narcissism, how does that blur into various forms of narcissistic problems, which has become synonymous with the popular culture definition? I take seriously, and I think part of grappling with this different kinds of narcissism, I take seriously Butler's question, what is the psychic life of power? Butler and others offer ways of thinking through the relationality of power to conceptualize theories of the subjugation of the subject, such as John Scott does, but discursively go beyond the binaries of the individual, social, or the psychic public. But there's a dependency to frame the subject formation is driven by the subject's desires for a full meeting of needs. That's what fantasy is about. Our fantasies cannot be realized. When we might desire and fantasize to experience complete satisfaction, but it's not possible. And that comes up again and again in various forms of literature, not only on violence, but on various forms of other subjects. Butler stresses the paradox within psychic formation of the subject, where the process of how the public sees us and how the public hails the interpolation assumes at once the pre-existence of a subject to be interpolated, yet insists that it's the operation of power that brings the subject into being. Yet, and this is the part of my struggle from sabbatical around understanding Butler and Lacan. Lacan argues that there is always fundamentally from early childhood a narcissistic misrecognition, and that is picked up and discussed by various scholars like Spivak. And then how we work through forms of narcissism, I would argue, is a structural linchpin, is central to understanding the psychic life of subjects through power relations, and which frame intersections between public interrelations and subject narcissism, driven ultimately by unfulfilled desires. As my students know, one of my favorite phrases is not to talk about desires, but to talk about unfulfilled desires. All desires, needs, and wants are unfulfilled. That shapes so much of the humanities, in my view. Yeah. And then to go back to Spivak, another short quote, narcissist marks an arrest where there should be a passageway to others, then a myriad of problematic socio-political effects follow. The extent to which the narcissistic core of the human subject has been seen or not seen, and how it's been configured, not only by parents or family dynamics, but also what has become more and more evident through a lot of the transgenerational literature has been through how the public, I'm trying to work out. The social subjection of the subject begins early childhood and configures the psychic contours of narcissism, vulnerability, and precarity that are preconditions for the logic of anti-referential trauma. Moments of direct violence or continual forms of accumulative structural violence might breach the subject's boundaries or be exposed to an array of possible social, scientific, psychic intersections that constitute anti-referential psychic trauma. But moving on, these different kinds of psychic trauma produced by different forms of structuration and subjugation needs a lot more thinking. And how do we engage this when we're in the company of someone in an oral history dialogue? And that's something I hope to do in later chapters. Finally, in the last couple of minutes I've got left, I want to talk about intersubjectivity and my little phrase. Passerini once said, 2002, and Luisa Passerini's Prof, where my work is closer to now, she said in 2002, subjectivity can no longer be conceptualized without getting priority to intersubjectivity. The relevance of intersubjectivity is primal, in the sense that the constitution of the subject is grounded in it. For our purposes, intersubjectivity is at the basis of the interview, which constitutes oral history, and is at the basis of interpretation. That's pretty standard for certain kinds of oral historians who follow in the footsteps of Pasolini and Portelli and a few others, but it's certainly very different to other forms that are in us. Another quote, but this is the more kind of Lacanian kind of quote on intersubjectivity. If the unconscious, this is by Tracy McNulty, if the unconscious is structured as a language, it is because it responds to and attempts to reconstruct the effects of speech on the living being. Speech is therefore not merely the medium in which the analytic situation unfolds, but the true object of analysis, inasmuch as it attests a different reality altogether, the intersubjective relation of the subject to the locus of the other. And it's a way into understanding the unconscious, the unseen, unheard dimensions of the intersubjective. I don't have time to go in a bit of a description of how intersubjectivity originated out of psychoanalysis, but gradually seeped into various particularly kind of continental forms of oral history pioneered by people like Pasolini. I'm going to read two final paragraphs. I'm cutting out half my lecture script. While we inhabit bodies, the existence of the individual is not natural, and it is a peculiar product of intersubjective navigation of forms of coercion and creativity. Neither language nor history, neither cultural nor social forms belong to any subject. To make matters more challenging, fueled by a primary narcissism, that's early childhood, before the child enters language, our childhood fantasies are becoming full, whole, unique, or perfect. And we carry on holding on to those kinds of fantasies, but it's immediately limited. The split starts with the beginning of the child entering language. But yet, we speak to this day, often in our everyday language, we speak of how do we develop my own voice? How do we develop my story? Such aspirations I have a lot of empathy for, but they are our narcissistic fantasies as writers, authors, different kinds of creators. So how do we facilitate narrators to creatively narrate beyond the cursive limits of language structures and other limits? How can oral historians understand the constitutive lack of differing desires of the narrator speaking intersubjectively to us as others? And we as others are the oral historians and others. These pressing questions need to be worked through as we strive to decipher the logic and efficacy of anti-referential trauma. Moreover, the liminal conditions of fieldwork dialogue curtail what can or cannot be said between specific participants in particular spaces. Inevitably, there will be remains of experiences, memories, imaginings that are not narratable and are untranslatable, especially in relation to past violence and its after effects. I hope in this book to explore how the fluctuating gradations of unfulfilled desires are framed through power relations and intersubject dialogues, and how fantasies and unfulfilled desires provide telling clues about subjectivity and identity formation. To put it differently, in different words, it is possible for the cracks in the mirror to intersubjectively illuminate ideas about the unheedable legacies of violence. In brief, the oral historian of violence must keep thinking through questions about the epistemology of violence, which requires an alertness to the everyday spaces, the relationships, and positionings the subjects live through. The after effects or effects of violence constituted through storytelling is crucial, as are the ways in which oral historians intersubjectively work through the productive dimensions of irreconcilable differences. So, with that, I'm going to stop. I hope, this is maybe my narcissistic aspiration, I hope someday when I finish this book, it'll be a productive response to this basic question. What makes post-colonial oral history different? Thanks for listening. That's me.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you for the dense paper. I don't know if I'm audible because I suddenly got this message.
Yeah.
Okay. Please, questions and comments as usual. You can use the hand tool or just switch on your video, whatever is convenient. The floor is open.
Shamil.
Okay, I hope I can be seen. Can I be seen? Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks. Thanks, Sean. I'm trying to gather my thoughts because it was very dense, but thanks so much. I also enjoyed life history interviews very much. I think it's really, for me, no other way to do oral history work, but the life history method, as it were. But why should we consider this to be oral history and not, say, anthropology or sociology or even psychology? That's one. So why do you insist on the word history? Yeah, because that's one question. I have a series of sub questions, but that's the first one. So that you can't go beyond the life experience of a certain subject, and how do you do history that will go beyond the life experience, say 2 or 3 generations before that subject? What then for oral history? Now, there's a big field of history in African history, which is the oral tradition, which stands in need of much more critique. And that hasn't been, there are a few things, but people are fearing to go there because we would be upsetting a very large part of African history. But that's the field of oral tradition, which is, the kind of griot and performance and so on, which is filled with problems, filled with problems. I mean, you don't need to read as thoroughly as you do the sort of narratives to find the faults. But some people still believe in the empirical data that's hard there, in that oral tradition. Anyway, so they have oral tradition. I'm not going to go there. But the limitations of oral history has always been the lifespan of the subject and possibly some nuggets of information from, a previous generation. So coming back to the question, why history? Why isn't it anthropology or sociology or psychology?
Look, I mean, there's different ways I can respond. I mean, partly I think, look, Shamil, you probably don't know the literature, but I think some of it, the first part of what you're saying, I mean, the memory studies, and some of it's very problematic, but some of it is certainly a deliberate, in the sort of the memory boom, as some people call it, especially on the continent, as try to go, or historians who are involved in that, have deliberately tried to find ways of going beyond the lived experiences of the subject, and that's what Portelli and Passerini were doing, I think, And also in terms of how, well, for example, it's not simply about what this person says to you, but it's, there's ways of doing interviews both in length, longitudinally, and sort of latitude. I think there are ways of making statements, but the memory studies group, what's very interesting, and it's what I've been grappling with it again recently, has been very shaped by Maurice Halbach's notions of collective memory, and then current versions is picked up by Pierre Nora and it's picked up by various scholars, and I find that very interesting. I mean, that's partly what, in a sense, these limits, what you're saying, describing as limits to oral history, is what drew me into kind of reading more on the various sort of on the psychoanalytic literature, whether it's from France or Germany or wherever. But I probably forgotten some other question. What I mean, in terms of disciplines, this is going to sound very I don't know, can I be honest? I've said this to my students before, postgrad students, but beyond undergrad teaching, I mean, the issue of disciplines, I understand why we have disciplines in the academy, but especially when you're getting into masters and PhD and beyond, the issue of disciplines is really, it's more of a hindrance. It's an intellectual imposition, and yeah, I mean, some of my students have, is it history? I don't really care. Is it anthropology?
Can't hear you. We can't hear you, Sean.
Yeah, I'm just saying I'm being provocative. If someone says I'm not
I think
being
Sean has
historical,
muted himself.
no, I'm still. Can others hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can
Maybe
hear
you.
you.
Yes, we can
hear you.
Okay, I'm going to stop. I mean, I think those disciplinary boundaries are unhelpful and too restrictive, Shamil. And I mean, for a long time, I was too embarrassed to say this publicly, but now I've reached a point in my career where I can openly say, and this might sound very pretentious, but I really am working in the borderlands between psychoanalysis and history, and you can include anthropology as well, and I think that's more productive. I mean, that's my response to that part of your question. To work in the borderlands and beyond the discipline boundaries is actually more intellectually more productive. So in that sense, I'm differing with you there. But maybe let's see Bodhi.
Yeah, Bodhi had a question. I think, maybe Shamil can come back if he wants to add to it. Bodhi, please go ahead.
No, not so much a question, just a kind of comment or a suggestion. And it kind of links up with what Shamil raised already. Obviously, this paper will be better grasped if read rather than hard, Sean. So, I'm just trying to kind of gather my thoughts. But obviously, and we have been having conversations, so I have some idea, and it was very nicely put. But I'm trying to think of. I noticed. Let me put it this way. I noticed a very particular absence. And that is, you talked about Spivak's echo, but the talk also reminded me of Eduardo Viveiras de Castro's last chapter in the 1992 book, From the Enemy's Point of View, which was famously titled The Anti-Narcissus, quite a play on Deleuze. And unlike Spivak's Echo, which was just published a year before that, and was a play with Freud's on narcissism, here Viveiras de Castro was essentially engaging anti-Oedipus in a Deleuze and Guattari's anti-Oedipus, and kind of trying to think about a pretty much similar question that you are trying to think from the point of view of oral history. He tried to think it from the point of view of anthropology. Because for him, the question was that Narcissus, if I remember correctly, was this kind of patron saint of the discipline. Because in the study of the other, the anthropologist is doomed to see the self. Right? So his whole point was, which, as you know, has led him in the last 10, 15 years to a very different journey and has opened up anthropology in a very provocative and productive way. This Anti-Narcissus was a very foundational text. And given the way you thought about, you reconfigured the problem of destitution of subject, intersubjectivity, quite different splinters from very different regimes of discourse. And I kind of, I'm thinking about the very, one comes from the hermeneutic route, one comes from, and I understand the need for the bricolage. But I'm also kind of can't stop thinking about that whether the problem that Viveiras de Castro was trying to pose in the case of anthropology is not very similar to what you are trying to pose in the case of oral history. So I don't know if you're familiar with that book or that chapter, but if you are, then I'd very much like to hear what you are thinking. If not, then I would very much suggest that might be one engagement which can help you to kind of bring this home in a slightly different way. But it's just kind of, you don't have to necessarily respond to this. It's just something that came to my mind as I was listening to you. Great paper, by the way.
I mean, thanks, Ben. That sounds fascinating. I mean, I haven't read that text. So, I mean, please send me the reference. I mean, I'm thinking about
The book is called From the Enemy's Point of View.
the enemy's point of view.
From the enemy's point of view.
Okay.
It was kind of a spin on the cannibal metaphysics that he wrote. It's 92. I think it's 92, 93. Quite an interesting book, and develops through the historical materials of historical anthropology, the 16th century encounters between missionaries and cannibals, and tries to think about what it means to think like a cannibal, a debate that later would be joined by David Graeber and others. But this particular chapter, I think theoretically is quite proximate to what you are thinking about. Just a suggestion.
No. Thanks, Barry.
Sean, do you want to take
I'm sort of,
sorry, Sean, do you want
Anybody
to
else?
take Joanne's question as well? And then Shamil also has a question. I don't know.
Joanne,
Joanne, and then Shamil also has another question. Do you want to take?
No.
No,
I just wanted to come back, but I'll come back later at the end if there is time. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe Joanne can put in her question, and then you can respond to the two.
Yes,
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sean. I do wish you had completed this book because it would be very useful to read. I have two particular areas of discomfort around the link between trauma and oral history, and also again between trauma and photography. And it has become so common that people write about trauma and talk about oral history interviews and the way in which these reflect trauma. And I'm worrying in the work that I'm doing about the ethical questions and about how, if one talks about someone as being traumatized because one picks up the signals in an interview, how in a single interview one can label a person or an experience as traumatic, what the response is when one then asks the person that one had the conversation with to read that, and the person then picks up that kind of labeling, and the kind of damage that happens or may potentially happen in the academic research process. It worries me about the effect on people. It worries me very deeply about the people that I've interviewed. And I think it has to do with the way in which trauma has become a throwaway term. The second discomfort I have, and it's a fight I'm trying to, an argument I'm trying to make in my thesis, is so many photographic scholars are writing about the traumatic effects of photographs. And I'm very reluctant to embrace that kind of argument. A photograph may affect. And I think somewhere along the line, the notion of an emotional response to something has been tied up in people's mind with trauma and done a lot of damage in the area of scholarly research, and in the way in which we speak to people and the way in which we write about people. And I'd be interested in your responses on the ethical question.
I mean, I honestly have reached a point now when, this may be just one thing, the first part of your first question. Look, the subject, people have all sorts of ways of doing self-description and all sorts of emotional vocabulary to describe what they went through and so forth. And we need to be empathic and respectful of that. But I don't like, for one of the things for me, developing a sort of anti-referential logic of trauma is immediately separating trauma from the subject, trauma from the memory, trauma from the narrative. As soon as you talk about traumatic subjects or traumatic memories or traumatic narratives, that for me is referential thinking. You've got to see, it's got to be a relationality. And so, that's my kind of broad way. I think also maybe a more immediate thing, and this is maybe me sounding like a survivor, I'm not a, oh God, that's a Freudian stuff. Supervisor.
You hope you survive.
No, but I would challenge you as someone who's grappling with these things, or any of my students that are not, get beyond the theoretical conversation. In terms of you asking me a question about interpreting interviews, right? Is write as much as possible about them when you interpret those dialogues and those stories or whatever, right? Try not to use the word trauma.
Yes.
Really, that's the anti-referential bit of advice. Do not use the language of trauma. I mean, if you want to expose the cracks in the mirror or how trauma might be there, you've got to write around it,
Yeah, thank you. That's what
if
I'm
you just
trying
say, oh, this is traumatic, it's a waste of time.
Yes,
Then
yes.
you're just slipping into the referential popular trend of the last 30, 40 years.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, it sounds completely like an oxymoron for me if someone does a course on trauma studies. Try not to use the word trauma in how you write about these subjects.
Thank you. Yes, no, that's an approach that I am taking now and having to rewrite and rethink a lot of the earlier stuff that I wrote because of my reluctance. But thank you. I'll follow that up.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joanne. Shamil, please go ahead. Please.
Oh yeah, no, thanks, Sean, for your response. And I just wanted to add, perhaps it would be clearer if you say oral history under capitalism. Because if I look at what you're dealing with, a theoretical literature that's very much grown out of conditions of a certain kind of accumulation and certain kind of traumas and neuroses, etc. If I look at, say, the Sahara and societies in the 18th century or before, I doubt very much, that I'm not averse to the theory at all, but just the material that I deal with and the periods that I have an interest in, it's very difficult. So since Graeber's name has come up and so on, and there's another book, a recent book, well, sometime it's just been translated, fairly recent translated in English, on alienation, which is the other concept which could be brought in there.
Yeah.
So, which this German philosopher defines as a relation of relationlessness.
Author?
Rahel, R-A-H-E-L. It's a recent work on alienation, which there hasn't been a lot of research. So I'm thinking that when you write, I mean, it would be necessary to say that as an oral historian dealing, it's very specific to use an old-fashioned term, types of social formation.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I've reached this point of where I, again, being very honest, Shamil, I mean, the label oral history on my head, which I've carried for 30 odd years, is, I mean, Bernie knows about this. I mean, I got quite easily dropped the notion oral history. It's just a label, really. What I'm really interested in, what does it mean to talk about violence? So yes, I've been trained in sort of oral history kind of methods. Yes, I've read a lot of oral history, but ultimately, I have a fascination and an obsession with how subjects from different contexts deal with violence. But part of that conversation has to be, as I said in my presentation, there has to be an epistemology of violence. What is violence? And I'm very interested in how people in different, I mean, it's oral history is too hamstrung. I agree. What I'm interested in, that's why I gave this quote in the presentation, is why, I mean, what's perhaps my biggest, most telling discovery in a sabbatical was how different ways of understanding intersubjectivity cuts across different disciplines, and how central it is even to someone who's a hardcore structuralist like Jacques Lacan. However, I know that other challenges and Bodhi said, I can't become a Lacanian because he's too ahistorical. But it's so speech. Speech is absolutely central. This is a strange thing. For all the problems I would share, I have on about oral history and oral history, the history of oral history. Interesting thing is what we share about speech and how it's shaped. And I'm interested in speech and violence, and people, you know, that's, I can't put it more cruder and clearer than that. So I don't care what people label they throw at me in the end, you know. So the question that I pose about the post-colonial oral history is a way of, you know, I don't know, maybe it's for the publishers, or maybe it's pushing people to think more differently. There's those that are committed to oral history. Yes. Last question.
Thanks, Sean. Maybe one last question, comment. Sorry, Joanne, is that an old hand, or do you have another question?
Sorry, no, I don't have another question. My
okay,
hand hasn't gone away.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought that was. But yeah. I mean, you don't have to answer, but I'm just curious, and it's a fascinating project. I'm just curious that as a student, if I come to you, is there a project that you can think of in terms of what it would mean, in terms of materially, in terms of the archive, what a post-colonial historical project would be?
Well, I mean, you know, thanks. It's a nice teaching. I really want to have more conversations about, I mean, in trying to understand anti-referential trauma and the literature around it. I mean, the notion of violence, that's what I mean by the epistemology of violence, is so a big question in my head, and I would love to have more conversations with you as someone who teaches on the histories of violence. But that's by the way. You know, one of the things that I would love, I would want, well, two examples. I would find it very interesting for more students to do work on transgenerational emotional burdens being transmitted across families, but to get away from the sort of referential notions of the transmitted trauma, which is what Arian Hirsch and Pumla Gomoda, Marikizera, and so forth have sort of disseminated worldwide. Is to understand parenting. Parenting in its complexities is really fascinating. And I think some students find it very interesting to talk about, but quite scary to do research about. If that makes any sense. And yeah, I mean, I would love to. I mean, Glance and I over times talked about doing something on the histories of childhood. It's another way in.
No, I find. Sorry, no, I just took. I won't take much time because it's already it's already. But I think that, you know, I kind of drawing on what Shamal was asking also, because I think there is a very complicated, especially in African historiography, a very complicated emotional place in which this kind of, you know, intergenerational familial stories are put, and the different receptions. I was just wondering, as an old you know, doyen of this, of whatever it might mean in practice, or as an oral historian, do you feel the need to actually participate in this and critique that, or do you feel that this is something which is actually, since it's not your remit at all, because a lot of the identity question, etc., now are taken up in terms of this kind of an Africa equal to oral history kind of
yeah, which I mean, yeah, I have got problems with that.
Anyway, you answered it, but I just thought that.
Yeah, no, I've got problems with that. But I really, I mean, one way of answering your question is I'm really, and maybe I mean, people might say I'm being biased because of someone who's a parent to teenagers and so forth, but I am fascinated by the histories of parenting and childhood, you know, and particularly fascinated in the sense to which, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, to the extent to which depends on who you read and follow, but how, in many ways, the sort of the bedrock of trauma is established in early childhood through particular ways in which the child is formed, and that the parents don't necessarily have to be survivors of some prior war or genocide. The reality is that if you really believe in what, like the arguments that Joan Scott's making, the subjugation of the subject begins in early childhood. The big shift that happens in psychological thinking and academically and clinically after the Second World War is all towards the earlier childhood. It's not simply about the Oedipal complex, which tends to be between the age of 5 and 7. Early childhood, when the child first realizes it's a separate subject and when the child enters language, is critical. And that's kind of, for me, I would be the part of what's interesting, getting students to interview or find ways of getting subjects to talk about their childhood. But it's tricky because early childhood, that which is unconscious, is outside of memory. That's partly what I'm grappling with.
Great. Okay, thank you, Sean. It's already 2:05. But thank you for the dense paper. Look forward to the book soon. And we will have a final seminar for the next week. Lloyd has volunteered. He'll share his work with us, an article he's submitting for a journal. See you then. Thank you for your participation and stay well. Have a good day.